The experts thought that you couldn't have a suburb like Stanford that would have Orthodox synagogues. It didn't make sense to them. Young rabbis like Herschel Schacter, Norman Land, Israel Miller, Gilbert Clapperman, and the others from their generation, they took a chance. They decided to throw in their lot with the idea that there could be an Orthodox future in America at a time when it was very uncertain that there would be. And that is very much to their credit. There's an interesting phenomenon among young Orthodox rabbis in the 40s and 50s. There's a significant number of young men who graduated from Orthodox rabbinical schools but took conservative pulpits, because that's how they saw the future of American Jewry going. Nobody could imagine the kind of rich Orthodox life that you find in America today. Nobody imagined that would exist, even decades down the line. So Herschel Schacter and his colleagues, it was a leap of faith, because they're putting their professional futures on the line. Herschel Schacter, as we just heard a little glimpse of it, a little audio of this. Herschel Schacter was an extraordinary speaker. There's no doubt he could have landed a prestigious conservative pulpit. And that was true for his other colleagues whom I mentioned. So they took a chance because they believed deeply in the idea that there could be an Orthodox future in America, and of course, time has proven that they were correct. But now back to the broader point that I wanted to make, and why I see a connection between the Buchenwald experience and something seemingly much more mundane, which is the daily life of a pulpit rabbi, whether in Stanford or the Bronx. Here's how I see it. When Rabbi Schacter stood in this pulpit and looked out to his congregation, he saw Jews of all different levels of observance. But he was determined to somehow forge a unified congregation, and beyond that, Jewish community, despite those differences. Now, that strikes me as a very admirable skill, and not a very common one. The understanding of the need to be flexible as a rabbi, to recognize that not everyone is on the level you hope they will someday be in terms of religious observance. To innovate, to come up with programs, whether it was that 8 o'clock, the 8 o'clock Friday night service, or tolerating a certain amount of flexibility in seating until you can gradually get to the point that you hope to reach. So how does one come across? How does one come to have that sense of conviction and the willingness to struggle and to sometimes put up with compromises that one doesn't necessarily want, but for the sake of a future more important goal? And here's where I see a certain connection to Buchenwald. And this goes to the broader question of Jewish unity and Jewish disunity. What Herschel Schacter saw in Buchenwald, and here I'm both reflecting from my own perspective as a historian, but also I'm kind of summarizing some of the points he made years later in sermons of his and in speeches before Jewish organizations that I've heard or studied of his. The idea of Jewish unity was extremely important to him, in large measure because he had seen firsthand the horrific consequences of Jewish disunity. He saw that that in Buchenwald, it made no difference if you were an Orthodox Jew or an atheistic Jew or anywhere in between. It didn't matter what country you came from. It didn't matter what language you spoke. It didn't matter what your religious preferences were. But in the end, he saw that the Jews had a common fate. In this case, a horrible fate. It didn't have to be that way, but that's how it was. So it seems to me that the Buchenwald experience burned into him the deepest imaginable appreciation for how important it was to overlook some of our smaller differences, to find the common ground. And so if it meant little compromises along the way as a rabbi in seating and programming, the things that didn't matter so much, but that would help forge a united Jewish congregation so the Jews could share what they had in common learn from each other, experience a Jewish life together, then in a sense, for him, I believe, that was a kind of victory over what Buchenwald represented. I think I'll conclude with that, and I'll be glad to take any questions that you have, and I think we can impose upon Rabbi Schacter also to take some questions if you have. Thank you.
I have a question for Rabbi Schacter. I know the famous photograph of your father leading the services in Buchenwald. I've seen captions that it was on Shavuos. I've seen other captions that it was a Shabbos service. Did your father ever tell you when that occurred? That's the first question. The second question, are there any other photographs taken of your father during the 2.5 months that he was in Buchenwald?
So, with regard to the second question, we saw some before. He's near a Jeep. He's talking to people in Buchenwald. He's wearing he's got a helmet on. He's wearing his boots. So we have some. My father didn't determine exactly when that was. I wrote an article in Tablet magazine a number of years ago when I tried to put together all of the evidence, and I don't know. There are multiple conflicting determinations. The most common one actually is none of the ones that you mentioned, and that was Pesach Sheni. Pesach Sheni is, if you can't celebrate Pesach the first time, you celebrate it the next month. And most evidence points to the fact that Pesach sounds like still Buchenwald. So now it's Pesach Sheni, it's a month later, and he commandeered matzah from the army for the soldiers, and he brought it into Buchenwald. And the service was a Pesach Sheni midweek evening service. But I have no idea. Some say Shavuos. I've seen survivors themselves in their memoirs take different positions on that question, so I don't know.
So this is the photo to which this gentleman was referring, and there's an interesting footnote to this. For those of you who have been to Yad Vashem, you may have seen that when you leave the museum, there's a huge enlarged version of this photograph up on the wall. And over the years, a number of people who have been able to, who have seen the photo, have been able to identify themselves in it. Because you have a very clear view, certainly, of the young man in the front rows. And so in the version that's at Yad Vashem, there's a kind of a chart accompanying the photo where they have listed with arrows pointing to identify those who can be so identified. Yes?
I'm curious whether the people in Buchenwald, the Jews, was there discrimination among the Jews, let's say the Putzians from the Litvaks, was there still that we see it in some of the Holocaust survivors that are around still today, that they do have a certain amount of bigotry, one Jew against the other. Was there any of that ever show up?
Well, I have not come across any of that kind of infighting in my research, which is not to say that there wasn't any, but it's also to say that persecution has a way of kind of breaking down and suppressing those kinds of differences. So I think it's safe to assume that that even those who might have privately harbored resentment of Jews from different backgrounds, given the horrific suffering that they were all enduring, it's probably not likely that there was a great deal of it. But in any event, I certainly have not encountered it in the Buchenwald memoir literature that I looked at in preparing this book. I did not come across any of that. Yes, in the back.
In the course of, of this lecture, the point was made that his goal, Rabbi Schachter's goal, was to help Jews to live and live for helping other Jews. Now, obviously, the experience at Buchenwald was seminal in shaping the trajectory of his experience in his life and career. How was this helping other Jews translated into helping, let's say, fellow Jewish people who came, army members who were there on the same day? Like, how did he help his fellow army people? That's what I'm wondering about.
Well, during the 2.5 years that Herschel Schacter served in the army before Buchenwald, so his normal duties included organizing religious services for the Jewish soldiers and counseling them when they had personal problems, in a few cases performing weddings for them. Sometimes he would speak in the local Jewish community. Let's say when he was stationed in New Orleans, then they would have him come and speak at the local Hadassah chapter and that sort of thing. So it's kind of ordinary chaplain duties. Now, he was on the battlefields in Europe, so that meant trying to do things like organizing a davening or helping somebody, let's say Kaddish or whatever it was, with bullets whizzing by. It's kind of hard to imagine what that experience was like. In the weeks before Buchenwald was liberated, Rabbi Schacter was tasked with having to help soldiers in some way celebrate both Purim and Pesach, neither of which could be done properly under battlefield conditions. Especially, by the way, in the case of Pesach, it was even more problematic because you're not supposed to eat matzah until after sundown, and yet they couldn't have like a seder in the nighttime when you're supposed to have it because the lights would give away their position. He talks about so he had to do all kinds of battlefield compromises. I would not be at all surprised if the compromises he was forced to make by wartime necessities also kind of helped build within him a certain flexibility, a certain understanding. Now, one cannot compare, the battlefields of Europe to situations, in America after the war, except in the more general sense that when reality intrudes, sometimes you've got to bend a little so that you don't break. And in the army, he was working with a lot of people, side by side, a lot of people who were very different from the Jews he knew. He was growing up in Brooklyn, where he was going to Orthodox, we went to Orthodox day schools, and then he went to Yeshiva University. Suddenly he finds himself among Reform chaplains, conservative chaplains, Jewish soldiers who were mostly non-observant. So suddenly he was thrown in with a whole bunch of very different kinds of Jews, and he had to find ways to get along. He had to. That was his job. It was the right thing to do. And he did it. He did it by every indication is that he was an exemplary chaplain. Because again, he developed the skill of working with people who were different from him, and that clearly served him very well for the rest of his life.
I would add to that question so really it's a good question. If you look at the picture, and I hope you'll look at the cover of the book, you'll see on the left side there are about 30 soldiers, American soldiers, who were at that service. So he's ministering to the soldiers while he's ministering to the survivors. So it's not like he gave up on them and only took care of the survivors.
Yes?
Did Rabbi Schacter ever opine about Roosevelt's role in the war, that maybe he could have done more?
Not in great detail, and I can only speculate as to why. I found here and there a few passing comments about how the Roosevelt administration abandoned the Jews. He was very cognizant of that. Most of his professional public life took place before the major scholarship, the major books about that subject came out. So when we speak about the 50s and the 60s and even well into the 70s, what we today call the abandonment of the Jews by President Roosevelt was not that well known. But it's interesting that later in life, when he was still very active, he was the chairman of the Jewish Community Relations Council, the JCRC's Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day Committee, in the 1980s, at a time when major books like David Lyman's The Abandonment of the Jews and Arthur Morris's While 6 Million Died had already come out. So it was not a subject to which that he addressed in detail, but it's clear from the occasional comments that he was aware of it. It was just not his particular focus. Remember, he occupied a very unique position in Jewish life. He was the only American Jewish leader, really, who could say, I was there in Buchenwald, and not just my unit passed through, but I went and I lived there for 2.5 months. So I think he understood that he had a particular, a unique position and a unique message to share. And that was to focus on what he himself had personally experienced. So after we conclude, I'll be at the back where the books will be for sale and for signing. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to bring them to me. Thank you.
I just want to conclude by thanking Rabbi Schacter and Professor Medoff. Just one kind of final thought. We as Jews always live with the sense that the suffering that we may have gone through or others have gone through needs to inform all of us in our daily lives. What Chaim Shmulevitz says, when the Jewish people were not yet out of Egypt, God said to them, you have to remember to free the slaves in the future. I think one of the greatnesses of your father was that it wasn't just immediately after the experience in Buchenwald that he felt that commitment to the Jewish people, but it pulsated within him always. And I think that's linked for all of us. Sometimes we, thank God, are not in the midst of the crucible, but to learn from your father really is a reminder for all of us to take responsibility for the entire Jewish people, what it means to be a blessing to the entire world, and hopefully we will continue to be inspired by his legacy, and God willing, share many wonderful, not only educational, but inspiring moments with you in the future. Thank you very much. The book is available. It's $25, and again, God willing, we'll share many wonderful times seeing everyone smile together. Have a good night. Sure, thank you.